Maya, you asked me a real question tonight, and you deserve a real answer. You want to know why Aunt Diane's name doesn't come up at this table anymore? Why her invitation stopped showing up on the mantel every November? You were 9 when it happened, old enough to remember the bank lobby, but young enough that some of it probably blurred. So let me tell you the whole thing, start to finish, the way I remember it. Because you were there for the ending, but you weren't there for everything that led up to it. Your aunt and I grew up under the same roof, but we grew up in 2 different families that happened to share an address. Diane was the one who got framed photos on the wall, honor roll, homecoming court, her acceptance letter to business school taped inside the kitchen cabinet like scripture. I was the one who got a nod and a "that's nice" when I made rank. Our parents weren't cruel people, Maya. They just decided early on who was going to matter, and they never revisited the decision. I'm going to take you back before you were born, back to when I was younger than I am now in this kitchen, and let you see it the way I saw it. I enlisted at 19, and in our house that translated to couldn't get into a real college. Diane went the other direction, finance degree, teller job at First Meridian, quick promotions, a company car by 26. Every family dinner became a highlight reel of her numbers, her bonus, her new title, her new condo. My deployments got mentioned the way you'd mention a hobby that hadn't quite worked out. He's still doing the army thing, my mother would say, like I was still figuring myself out at 31. I kept a ledger in my head back then, Maya. Not a bitter one. Not at first. Just a running tally of every dinner where my sister's promotion got a toast and my own got a nod. I wasn't proud of keeping it. But I kept it anyway, quietly, the way you keep track of anything that keeps happening to you. Diane had a particular talent for landing a compliment to herself inside an insult to me. Someone in this family had to be practical, she'd say, refilling her wine, smiling at our parents like she'd said something generous. Not everyone can afford to play soldier forever. I let it go. I always let it go. I told myself rank would speak for itself eventually, that results don't need defending. What Diane didn't know, what nobody in the family knew, because I never advertised it, was that my army thing had turned into something else on the side. A few of us from my old logistics unit had started a small veteran-owned freight and supply company after my second deployment, working nights and weekends to get it running while I was still active duty. It was modest for years. Then it wasn't. A larger firm made an acquisition offer. My partners and I said yes. And the paperwork that came out of that deal had my name on a number I hadn't said out loud to anyone in my family. Not once. Not even at Christmas. I didn't hide it out of shame, Maya. I hid it because I'd watched Diane use every piece of information as a weapon or a trophy, and I didn't want to hand her either. I wanted, for once, to walk into a room without my worth being pre-negotiated by what everyone already assumed about me. The check itself, $10 million, my share of the buyout, arrived on a Tuesday, and I remember staring at it on the kitchen table where you used to do your homework, thinking it didn't feel real. It felt like a piece of paper pretending to be a life. I decided I'd deposit it properly, in person, the old-fashioned way, at a real bank with a real banker, instead of some faceless online transfer. I didn't think about which bank until later that week, when I remembered Diane had transferred branches the year before. Regional coordinator now, she'd mentioned once, at First Meridian's downtown location. The same First Meridian. I told myself it didn't matter. In hindsight, Maya, that's usually when it matters most. That same week, I was promoted. Full colonel, a ceremony on base with your mother there. You in your good dress fidgeting through the whole thing, me standing a little straighter than I had in years. I hadn't planned to wear the dress uniform anywhere else that day, but the ceremony ran long, and the bank's downtown branch was closing early for a renovation, and I didn't have time to change if I wanted to get that check deposited before the window closed. So I went straight from the ceremony to the bank, still in uniform, eagles freshly pinned on my shoulders, you in the back seat asking if we could get ice cream after. I want you to notice something here, because it matters for what comes next. I wasn't performing anything. I wasn't walking in there to prove a point. I was a father trying to bank a check before closing time, still dressed from an event that had nothing to do with my sister at all. Everything that happened after that was entirely her doing, not mine. I need you to understand that distinction, because for a long time I wondered if I'd somehow invited it. I can see you leaning forward a little, Maya, the same way you did in the car afterward, wanting me to just get to it. I promise I'm getting there. But you need the before to understand why the then hit as hard as it did, because nobody just snaps at a bank counter over nothing. Diane had been building toward that moment for 20 years without either of us realizing it. We walked in, you and I, and there she was behind the platform desk in a blazer that probably cost more than my monthly housing allowance, mid-conversation with a colleague, laughing at something. She saw me before I saw her, and her face did this thing, a flicker of surprise, then something harder settling in underneath it, like she was recalculating who I was allowed to be in that building. "Well, look who it is," she said, loud enough for 3 teller windows to hear. "Didn't know they let soldiers borrow the fancy jacket for the day. I let that one go too, Maya. Old habit." I told her I needed to deposit a check and asked if she could help or point me to someone who could. She waved me toward her own desk instead, maybe wanting an audience, maybe just wanting the satisfaction of processing her brother's modest little army paycheck herself. I sat down. You sat beside me, swinging your legs, still thinking about ice cream. I slid the check across the desk face down out of habit, old operational instinct, keep information close, and she flipped it over without asking. I watched her face change in real time. First confusion, like the number didn't parse. Then a kind of scanning disbelief, checking the signature line, the account holder name, the routing information, like she was hunting for the error that would make it make sense again. Then something uglier arrived and settled over both. Not joy, not even shock exactly. Something closer to threat. "This is a joke," she said. Not a question. I told her it wasn't, that it was proceeds from a company sale, and could she process the deposit. "And Maya, I need you to hear this next part exactly the way it happened, because I know you remember pieces of it, but I want you to have the whole shape." She stood up. She held the check in both hands, and for one long second, I actually thought she was going to hug me, or cry, or say something that resembled pride for the first time in either of our lives. Instead, she tore it in half, and then in half again, right there at her desk, in front of her colleague, in front of a line of customers, in front of you. "You're a broke failure playing dress up," she said, loud, almost gleeful, like she'd been rehearsing it for years and finally found her stage. $10 million? From what? Your little truck company. Nobody hands a soldier $10 million, so either this is fraud or you printed it in your barracks. You started crying, Maya. Not loud, just that quiet, confused kind of crying kids do when the adults around them stop making sense. I remember reaching for your hand under the desk more than I remember anything Diane said next. But I do remember this. She picked up the desk phone, dialed security, and told them, calm as anything, that a man had presented a fraudulent check and was refusing to leave. 2 guards flanked me within a minute. She'd also, I found out later, quietly signaled the teller to call the police non-emergency line. Just as a precaution, she told them, given the amount. I stood there in my dress uniform, torn check in pieces on the desk between us, my daughter crying against my side, boxed in by 2 security guards who clearly didn't want to be doing this to a man in that uniform, but had been told it was fraud. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't reach for anything. I just asked, quietly, if someone could call the branch manager, because I had documentation for the deposit in my jacket pocket and I would rather resolve this like adults. That's when the office door at the back of the lobby opened, and a man in a gray suit came out fast, already talking before he'd fully cleared the doorway. Something about a customer complaint, about slowing down before anyone called anyone else. He stopped mid-stride about 10 feet from me. And Maya, I watched his whole face rearrange itself in about 2 seconds flat. I hadn't recognized the name on his branch badge until that exact moment because I hadn't been looking for it. Frank Reynolds. Staff Sergeant Frank Reynolds, from a deployment 9 years earlier, a kid barely out of his 20s back then, pinned down with 2 others in a supply convoy that took fire outside a checkpoint none of us talk about much anymore. I'd made a call that day that got him and 2 other soldiers out alive and cost me a knee I still feel every winter. I hadn't seen him since his discharge. I didn't know he'd gone into banking. I definitely didn't know he ran this branch. He looked at my face, then at the eagles on my shoulders, then at the torn check on the desk, and he went pale in a way I have honestly never seen a grown man go pale. He lowered his head, not dramatically, just quietly, like the air had gone out of the room, and he said 2 words. Colonel Whitfield. Diane's whole posture changed at the sound of it, like she was hearing my last name for the first time in her life. Frank apologized to me before he'd even gotten a full sentence out, called off the security guards with one raised hand, and asked, voice shaking slightly, whether I was hurt, whether anyone had touched me, whether he needed to call anyone. I told him I was fine, that my daughter was scared, and that I needed the check I'd brought in honored or reissued, because it was legitimate and I had the paperwork to prove it. What came out over the next 20 minutes, Maya, is the part you were too young and too shaken to fully absorb at the time. So let me lay it out clean. Frank pulled Diane into his office immediately and confirmed the acquisition paperwork himself, on the phone with the buyer's bank, in under 10 minutes. Turns out verifying $10 million moves a lot faster when the branch manager personally recognizes the depositor. He arranged for the check to be reissued and processed that same afternoon, no further questions. And then, in front of two regional compliance officers who'd been called in over the fraud report Diane herself had filed, he asked her, flatly, whether she had run any verification at all before destroying a customer's negotiable instrument and calling security on him. She hadn't. She'd looked at a number, decided it couldn't belong to her little brother, and acted on 20 years of assumption instead of 30 seconds of due diligence. That distinction is what ended her career at that bank, not the number on the check and not the uniform I happened to be wearing. Frank told me later, privately, that the destruction of a verified negotiable instrument combined with a false fraud report was more than enough on its own. My history with him just meant he moved fast instead of slow. I'm back here with you now, Maya, in this kitchen, years past all of that, and I want to close the loop honestly instead of leaving it as a legend. Diane was placed on leave within the week and left the bank entirely within 2 months, not fired outright by policy, from what I understand, but eased out the way people are when nobody wants to be the one to keep them around. I didn't push for that. I want to be clear about that part. I gave a factual statement when compliance asked, and I let the facts do what facts do. The money itself was never really the point, and I think that surprised her more than anything. She kept waiting for me to lord it over her, and I never did. We haven't spoken since, not out of some grand principle, just because there was nothing left to build a conversation on top of. I sent one letter, about a year later, saying the door wasn't locked if she ever wanted an honest conversation instead of a scoreboard. I never heard back. That's her ledger to keep now, not mine. Frank and I still get coffee twice a year. He tells people at that bank, half joking, that the scariest audit of his career walked in wearing dress blues and asking about a checking account. I let him have that one. He earned it, that day outside the checkpoint, long before any of this. So that's why Aunt Diane isn't on the mantle anymore, Maya. Not because of a torn piece of paper, and not because of a number. Because she looked at her own brother and decided, on sight, that he couldn't possibly be what he was, and she was willing to humiliate him in front of his daughter to protect that assumption. I'm not telling you this so you'll hate her. I'm telling you because someday somebody is going to underestimate you the exact same way, and I need you to know that the true answer to that isn't a bigger number or a fancier uniform. It's simply refusing to let someone else's small idea of you become the final word. If this one hit you the way it hit me writing it out, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if you've got a story like this sitting in you, one that finally deserves to be told out loud, this is the place to tell it. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.